Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in this talk, I would like to talk on some names that we have not talked about before, and go into more detail on some that we have mentioned. So I'd like to talk on King Henry VIII of England, and also more on Erasmus, and on Sir Thomas More, and a man by the name of Standish, and Cardinal Wolsey. Now, Sir Thomas More and King Henry VIII, they were friends with Erasmus, which in all probability exercised a certain influence over the destines of England. Now, here is Henry's story with Erasmus, his history with Erasmus. Now, as we have already talked about, Henry's grandmother, the Countess of Richmond, was a pious woman, and she had a passion for study. Both Henry and his older brother, Arthur, had trembled in their father's presence, but they were captivated by the affection of their pious grandmother and began to find pleasure in the society of learned men. Among the Countess's friends was Erasmus. Henry had met Erasmus when he was only 9 years old. Erasmus was impressed by the boy, who had handsome features, a royal posture, intelligent eyes, and exquisite courtesy. From that time, Erasmus, he kept up friendly interactions with Henry. Now, Erasmus was delighted to see the young prince excel in all the manly sports of his day. Henry, he sat on his horse with perfect grace, and he could hurl a javelin further than any of his companions. He had an excellent taste for music, and was already a performer on several instruments. Henry's father had taken care that his second son, Henry, should receive a learned education. Erasmus noticed Henry's aptitude for everything that he undertook, and he did his best to cut and to polish this English diamond, that it might glitter with even a greater brilliancy. "He will begin nothing that he will not finish," said Erasmus. Now, this was true, even if it was necessary to tread on the bleeding bodies of those that he had loved. However, Erasmus was attracted by Henry's winning grace, and he was charmed by his wit. Now, in the early part of 1502, Prince Arthur, he fell ill, and on the 2nd of April he died. The necessary time was taken to be sure that his wife, Catherine, had no hope of becoming a mother. And then the youthful Henry, friend of Erasmus, was declared heir to the crown, and this was to the joy of all of the learned. Henry did not forsake his studies. He spoke and he wrote in French, German, and Spanish. England hoped to behold one day the most learned of Christian kings upon the throne. Henry VII, his mind, however, was filled with covetousness. Must he restore to Spain the 200,000 ducats which formed Catherine's dowry? Shall this rich heiress be permitted to marry some rival of England? To prevent such great a misfortune, he united Henry to Arthur's widow. The most serious objections were argued against it. It is not only inconsistent with propriety, but the will of God himself is against it, it was said. Now, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21 says that if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. And Mark chapter 6, verse 18 says, "It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife," end quote. So finally, the Pope did give permission that Catherine and Henry were able to be married. So they were betrothed, but not married in consideration of the youth of the Prince of Wales. After this, King Henry VII fell sick, and he also lost his queen. Now, this was looked upon as visitations of divine judgment. The nation it murmured and demanded whether it was in the Pope's power to permit what God had forbidden. When King Henry VII died, King Henry VIII was crowned king. Now, to an Englishman, Erasmus had said of King Henry, "You don't know what a treasure you have in England. I will just show you." And he took from a box a letter of Henry's expressing in Latin of considerable purity the tenderest regard for his correspondence. Erasmus everywhere proclaimed that England at last had found his Octavius. Immediately after the coronation, Erasmus was told, "Our Henry Octavius is on the throne. Come and behold the new star. The heavens smile, the earth leaps for joy, and all is flowing with milk, nectar, and honey." End of quote. Erasmus hastened to London, where he was met with a hearty welcome from Henry. Science and power embraced each other. England was about to have its Medici, and the friends of learning no longer doubted of the regeneration of Britain. Though Erasmus was a monk, Pope Julius II had permitted Erasmus to exchange the white frock of the monks for the black dress of the scholars. When the news of Henry's coronation arrived to Erasmus, he had been visiting the Pope. Now, Julius II, the Pope, Julius II, had little taste for letters, but he was fond of war and hunting and the pleasures of the table. The English sent the Pope a dish to his taste in exchange for the scholar, Erasmus. In 1529, Sir Thomas More became Lord Chancellor. He was also Erasmus's friend, and here is his history with Erasmus. Now, the two first met while dining with the Lord Mayor. Now, Erasmus noticed on the other side of the table from him a young man of 19, slender, with blue eyes, coarse hands, and the right shoulder somewhat higher than the other. His features indicated friendliness, and pleasant jests were continually dropping from his lips. If he could not find a joke that was in English, he would do it in French or even in Latin or Greek. A literary contest soon ensued between Erasmus and the English youth. The former, astonished at meeting with anyone that could hold his own against him, this is Erasmus, he exclaimed, "You are either More or nobody," end of quote. And his companion, Sir Thomas More, he quickly replied, "You are either the devil or Erasmus." End of quote. So More, he flung himself into the arms of Erasmus, and they became inseparable friends. More was continually joking, even with women, teasing the young maidens and making fun of the doll, though without any tinge of ill nature in his jests. But under this sportive exterior, he concealed a deep understanding. Now, at this time, he was lecturing on Augustine's City of God before a numerous audience that was composed of priests and aged men. Now, the thought of eternity had seized More. However, being ignorant of that internal discipline of the Holy Ghost, which is the only true discipline, he had taken to scourging himself every Friday. Sir Thomas More was the ideal of the Catholicism of this period. He had, like the Romish system, two poles, worldliness and asceticism. which, although contrary, often meet together. In fact, asceticism makes a sacrifice of self only to preserve it, just as a traveler attacked by robbers will readily give up a portion of his treasure to save the rest. This was the case of Sir Thomas More, if we rightly understand his character. He sacrificed the accessories of his fallen nature to save the same nature. He submitted to fasts and vigils, wore a shirt of hair cloth, mortified his body by small chains next to his skin, and in a word, he immobilized everything in order to preserve that self, which a real regeneration alone can sacrifice. Now, there was a bishop, and his name was Standish. He was actually the bishop of Asaph. Now, Aubigne describes him as a narrow-minded man, rather fanatical, but probably sincere, of great courage, and not without some degree of piety. He was determined to preach a crusade against Erasmus's New Testament, and he began at London, in St. Paul's Cathedral, before the mayor and a corporation. "Away with these new translations," he said, "or else the religion of Jesus Christ is threatened with utter ruin." End quote. But Standish was deficient in tact, and instead of confining himself to general statements, like most of his party, he endeavored to show how far Erasmus had corrupted the gospel, and continued in a whiny voice. "My lord," he said, turning to the mayor, "magistrates of the city and citizens, fly to the succor of religion." End quote. Standish continued his pathetic appeals, but his oratory was all in vain. Some stood unmoved, others shrugged their shoulders, and others grew impatient. The citizens of London seemed determined to support liberty and the Bible. Standish, seeing the failure of his attack in the city, he sighed and groaned and prayed. He repeated Mass against the dreaded book, Erasmus's New Testament. He determined to try to do more. One day, during the rejoicings at the king's court for the betrothal of the Princess Mary, who was only then 2 years old, with a French prince who had just been born, Standish suddenly made his way through the crowd and threw himself at the feet of King Henry VIII and his wife Catherine. All were thunderstruck and asked one another what the old bishop was doing. "Great king," said Standish, "your ancestors who have reigned over this island, and yours, O great queen, who have governed Aragon, were always distinguished by their zeal for the church. Show yourselves worthy of your forefathers." Standish went on to say, "Times full of danger come upon us. A book has just appeared and been published too, by Erasmus. It is such a book that if you close not your kingdom against it, it is all over with the religion of Christ among us." End quote. When the bishop stopped speaking, there was a dead silence. Standish knew that King Henry had a love of learning, and he felt that this could be an obstacle to his prayer. Erasmus also was a friend to King Henry VIII. Standish, in a dramatic way, he raised his eyes and hands towards heaven, and kneeling in the midst of the courtly assembly, he exclaimed in a sorrowful tone, "O Christ, O Son of God, save thy spouse, for no man cometh to her help." End quote. Then the bishop, whose courage was worthy of a better cause, He rose up and waited. Sir Thomas More was present, and remember, was also Erasmus's friend. He asked, "What are the heresies this book is likely to engender?" Now Standish, using his fingers to count, he claimed that the book destroyed the resurrection, the sacrament of marriage, and the Mass. The Catholic queen, Catherine, she shuddered as she saw Standish's 3 fingers, signs of the 3 heresies of Erasmus. The friends of literature demanded for there to be proof. "I will give it," said Standish. Then he brought forward such foolish reasons that even the women and the unlearned, they were ashamed of them. The more that he endeavored to justify his assertions, the more confused that he became. He affirmed, among other things, that the epistles of St. Paul, they were written in Hebrew. A doctor of divinity, kneeling before the king, said, "There is not a schoolboy that does not know that Paul's epistles were written in Greek." End of quote. Henry, blushing for the bishop, he turned the conversation, and Standish, ashamed, he withdrew, unobserved. "The beetle must not attack the eagle," was whispered in his ear. There was, however, a more formidable adversary than Standish that aspired to combat the Reformation, not only in England, but in all the West. One of those ambitious designs which easily germinate in the human heart developed in the heart of Henry VIII's chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey, as chancellor and legate, he governed both in the state and in the church. He was the favorite of Henry VIII, almost his master, and was treated as a brother by the emperor, by the King of France, and by other crowned heads. He believed that if God permitted a Luther to appear in the world, it was because he had a Wolsey to oppose him. Wolsey desired to be the first priest, like Henry desired to be the first king. The imperial crown, vacant by the death of Maximilian, was sought by 2 princes. One was Charles of Austria, who ended up being the next emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was cold and a calculating man, caring little about pleasures and even the pomp of power, but forming great designs and knowing how to pursue them with energy. The second one was King of France, Francis I. He was a man of less penetrating glance and less untiring activity, but more daring and impetuous. Henry VIII, King of England, was inferior to both. He was passionate, impulsive, and selfish, but also strove to win the monarchy of all Christendom. At Wolsey's instigation, Henry supported 3 candidates at once. At Paris, he was for Francis I. At Madrid, he was for Charles V. And at Frankfurt, he was, of course, for himself. So Wolsey flattered himself that, hidden under the cloak of his master's ambition, he might satisfy his own. He thought that if he could get the crown of the empire for Henry, he might easily obtain the tiara of the popes for himself. Henry was then 31 years old. Aubigne describes him as tall, strongly built, and proportioned. He had an air of authority. His countenance expressed what was in his mind. He was vehement and presumed to make everything give way to the violence of his passions. He thirsted for glory. He, at first, concealed his faults under a certain impetuosity, that is particular to youth. He loved flattery, and there was no want of flatterers. Henry loved to visit, in the company with his courtiers, the house of his chaplain, Thomas Wolsey, who Henry held in favor. Henry was allured to Wolsey's residence by the attractions of pleasures and disorders in which the young prince would not have ventured to indulge in his own palace. The papal sub-collector in England at this time records this. In these dissolute meetings, Thomas Wolsey surpassed the licentiousness of the young courtiers who attended Henry VIII, and he was also father of several illegitimate children. Forgetful of the decorum befitting a minister of the church, Wolsey, he would sing, dance, laugh, play the fool, fence, and indulge in obscene conversation. Henry loved it all, and gave Wolsey the first place in the king's councils. And as sole minister, all the princes of Christendom were forced to purchase the favor of Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was Chancellor of England and Cardinal and Legate of Rome. This man, whose pride had attained the highest place, thought himself the equal of kings. He used to sit in a chair of gold, sleep in a golden bed, and had a cloth of gold that was spread on the table during his meals. His household consisted of 800 persons, among whom were barons, knights, and sons of the most distinguished families. These hoped that by serving Wolsey, they would obtain public offices. Silk and gold glittered not only on his garments, but also on his house and even the harnesses of the horses. When parading himself, he would walk with a tall priest before him, bearing a silver column terminated by a cross. Behind him, another ecclesiast of similar height carried the cross of York, and a nobleman at his side held the cardinal's hat. King Henry lived in the midst of balls, banquets, jousting, and he riotously squandered the treasures that his father had solely accumulated. Magnificent tournaments succeeded each other without interval. In these sports, the king, who was distinguished above all the combatants by his manly beauty, played the chief part. If the contest appeared for a moment doubtful, the strength and the address of the young monarch, or the fear of his opponents in not giving the king the victory, would end with resounding shouts and applause in the honor of the king. Henry loved the adulation, and his vanity was so inflated that there was no success in the world to which he thought he might not aspire. Henry's wife, Catherine, was 8 years Henry's senior, and was also the aunt to Charles V. Catherine had a truly Catholic Spanish piety. She would leave her bed in the middle of the night to take a silent part in the prayers of the monks. She would kneel down without cushion or carpet. At 5 a.m, after taking a little rest, she would again rise and put on the Franciscan dress, for she had been admitted into the Third Order of St. Francis. Throwing a royal cloak around her, she would go to the church at 6 o'clock to join in the service. Henry and Catherine were very different people, living in very different spheres. Catherine would be seen among the spectators at Henry's sport competitions, but she had a serious and a sad look, and her absent and dejected air formed a striking contrast with the noise and the glitter of the festivities. Now, there is much more to this history, but we are going to have to get into that in future talks. So I just am hoping that you're enjoying this history. I think there is much that we can learn on studying this fabulous history from Aubigne on the history of Protestantism during this time. So if you have not already subscribed, I would encourage you to click on that subscribe button. I want to thank those of you who have subscribed, and I would just encourage you to keep listening. There's much that we can learn from this history. So God bless each one of you, and I will be looking forward to seeing you in the next talk.